Welcome to Tammany Tech 101. I'm Grant Black, Director of Technology for St. Tammany Parish Government. Today on the program, we have Lee Comer with Foresite Group. Lee, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So Lee, we got broadband money from ARPA, about a year ago. I opened an RFP. You guys responded. We know there's $65 billion in the infrastructure law. So what do you expect for broadband planning to come from that?
I think we're going to see a few things happen. First of all, this is a significant amount of funding, something we've never really seen before at this scale. And it's being passed down from the federal government through NTIA down to each individual state who will evaluate their own state and disseminate those funds. Now, a lot of this is focused on rural America. So they've divided service boundaries into three different tiers, being served, which means you have more than 100 megabytes per second download, and then between 25 meg download, 3 meg upload. That range is called underserved, meaning that you do have some service, but it could be improved. And then anything below that 25 megabit download, 3 megabit upload speed, anything under that's considered unserved. And that unserved group is the primary folks that they're really wanting to focus on. But we're going to see that money being spent on some different aspects of network. That could be in the middle mile space, which is where you're building out areas and creating a ring construction. It could also be used on last mile, which is getting from that last mile to each individual residence so that that consumer has true internet access and real broadband connectivity. I think it's going to be a really great thing to see. It's something we've not ever done before as a country or as an industry, so it's a brand new field for us to be investigating.
So broadband planning, how'd you get into this? What do you expect the industry to go?
So we got into the planning aspect. Like most of my peers, we were doing design and engineering for telecommunications companies. And more of this is moving into the municipal space. And sometimes that means that the municipal space is actually managing the network ownership, but at least are being a part of that process and being a partner with those telcos. And in 2015, when we started the group at Foresite, we came in with a focus on working with communities and trying to solve for that aspect where there is not the connectivity that you may see in more dense, wealthier areas. Planning is absolutely essential to understanding where the needs are, where you have infrastructure, where you don't have infrastructure. That's not always readily available. That's improved over the past few months and years with some of the FCC mapping. But taking a clear picture of what that community has, what they don't have, and then creating a solution to provide for that gap. And once you've done that, you understand what the capital and operational expenditures are going to be. But then you still need to develop a plan to move that forward. How do you fund that? Who's going to manage that process? Who's going to own and operate that network? Mm-hmm. And then once you understand that, what does the revenue picture look like? All of that's part of that planning aspect that gets you into a position that you can apply for those funds.
So is this like smart city initiatives, things like that?
It should be. A lot of what we're looking at right now is very focused on typically residential consumer internet access. And because of COVID, we all know that that's a critically important aspect for kids doing homework at home, people who are working from home, certainly. But we do need to look beyond just internet access to what I call just broadband connectivity or connected communities. Mm-hmm. So looking into governments being connected to run their operations. What does it look like for police, fire, any kind of emergency connectivity? Cellular or wireless connectivity is certainly an aspect of this. But we can also look past just internet-based services to other services like SCADA or AMI, which affects utility switching and monitoring. Or even in the future, when we start looking at telemedicine, which is beyond telehealth, where you've actually got devices at the end in the home that people can connect to. And anything that's security-based or anything of that nature may not be necessarily internet-based, but it still needs that digital broadband connectivity.
Okay. So the focus on rural communities, that kind of gets difficult as far as just reaching out that far, areas that are, forested. What are the difficulties you see in the rural communities?
So At first blush, you're looking at two major aspects, which is why they haven't been served today. When you start looking at that business model, it is a lot of times rural communities have lower economies. They're not as wealthy as some of the more urban or suburban areas. So that's one aspect for sure. But probably a larger aspect is the density model. So instead of looking at homes per mile, you might even be looking at miles per home. So once you're building that infrastructure, you're trying to understand what that revenue model looks like. So density plays a really large part of that.
Yeah, density is really why they're not served currently, right?
Yes, that's accurate. Yes.
All right. So we're going to take a break for a minute, and when we come back, I want to talk about some other work that you've done that maybe is pertinent to St. Tammany Parish.
Connecting with family and friends and with safety officials can be critical during weather emergencies. The wireless emergency alerts on your cell phone and the emergency alert system on TV and radio can provide vital information. You should create an emergency communications plan to prepare for possible power outages. Sign up to receive additional emergency alerts from your local government, school, and workplace. Check and fully charge all phones and backup batteries and locate chargers and portable radios. Store at least one contact as in case of emergency and make sure that person knows if you have medical issues. And make sure everyone in your house knows how to text. If a disaster occurs, follow these guidelines. Call 911 only when necessary and limit non-emergency calls. Avoid repetitive redialing to minimize network congestion. Try texting if a call doesn't go through. And if your electricity is out, conserve battery power. Learn more at fcc.gov/emergency.
All right, Lee, welcome back. And we're going to continue our conversation. We're going to talk about some of the innovation you guys have done with Foresite, maybe Wi-Fi, some things you guys are doing that are just advancing technologically.
Sure. So I guess a few advances that we can see in the use of technology in our industry. One of those is certainly GIS. Using that as a design tool. It's a good retention database for these types of networks. And it's not just for the broadband aspect where you're wondering what poles you're going to attach to or where you're going to place conduit and fiber, but this is a good database that you can look at other aspects of a community. And I think that's critically important because broadband connectivity is going to affect so many different aspects of living, working, and playing in that community. So GIS as an application, I think, is one critical aspect that a lot of communities haven't fully embraced yet. Another technology that we've really moved into is the use of automation, automated design processing, things of that nature. And these are really great tools when you're looking at anything from a high-level plan, where you're trying to get a quick picture of what it's going to cost to build that out, how much road mileage you might have in a community. But again, it's a tool that a designer would use, an engineer would use in order to better understand that market space. Those are a few technologies we've really relied on in the past few years.
Okay. So I think you had mentioned Wi-Fi antennas. Is that something you guys have done before?
So we've certainly, well, let me take a step back.
Sure.
A lot of times I get asked this question, why do I want to be thinking about fiber when wireless is progressing so fast? And that's a valid question. So to me, you can't separate the two. When I think about the devices that we use today, like my cell phone or your laptop or any other kind of connected device, they're almost all wireless. But what that means is you need more bandwidth, more robustness in that wireless network, and that really can be best achieved by a fiber connection to that antenna. If you hear about things like small cell or Wi-Fi systems or distributed antenna systems, all those things really need to have a fiber backhaul. You're going to have a lot more antennas in any given market space, whether that's a stadium or in a hospital or a school environment, or maybe in a downtown walkable retail space. Lots more antennas, meaning you need lots more fiber. So all those things dovetail together. So when we're thinking about what a network would look like in a community, it's not just fiber to some location that somebody's going to plug in a device, but it's all the different kinds of devices that can use that fiber connectivity.
Well, it's funny because we have parades here and you get a large group of people in an area, like a festival or anything, and then you get 5 bars on your cell phone, but you really can't connect to anything. You got network saturation. So the
That's
enhanced fiber would really reduce that network saturation.
Absolutely. So you're starting to see a lot of offloading and augmentation. So everybody's seen the big, tall cell towers.
Sure.
A lot of those have been decorated. You may see those located on billboards or other structures. You're starting to see a lot more deployment of small cell, where it's a way to get a smaller footprint with greater density of service in that footprint. So more people within an area can use that service. But it's also a great way to offload the burden on those larger cell towers. So that's one aspect. Now, something else you mentioned is when we talk about any kind of a wireless service, whether that's fixed wireless, Wi-Fi or DAS, or even cellular technologies, we need to be thinking about what does that spectra that they're utilizing, what does it look like and how does it work? So you may hear things like millimeter wave. 5G has been a big buzzword, and those are usually associated together. And that's really great in super dense areas, but it's not the kind of thing that you'd want to use in a dense or a more rural area. Whereas some of the lower frequencies, and we're even looking at stuff in the TV white space, which is under 6 megahertz, those kinds of wireless services have great penetration. They go longer distances, and they may not carry the same bang for the buck that a millimeter wave does, but it's a different application.
Sure.
But still, either end of that spectrum, you still need that fiber connectivity to support that kind of a network.
When we started the fiber project, I was talking to people and some experts, and they tell you, well, we need to put Wi-Fi antennas here or increase things here or add all these services. But as we were going through it, I kept thinking, well, we have to have fiber in the ground to utilize any of this. So really the backbone was the fiber, and then everything builds off of that. And if we don't have the backbone, we can't do much.
Absolutely. It's critical to have that basic infrastructure. And I referenced this earlier, that middle mile. Mm-hmm. That's that kind of network connectivity that can connect these antennas or other use cases. And then that last mile, that's how you come from that middle mile to the consumer. So that last mile could be a fiber to the home or fiber to the prem. It could also be a wireless connection. So there's lots of ways to do that, but you do need that basic middle mile infrastructure in place to support whatever last mile configuration you select.
So I've heard middle mile, last mile. We haven't talked about drop, which literally comes up the driveway into the houses. And that's one of the problems we have in our community, where we've got, especially in the rural areas, it might be a quarter mile from the street to someone's house. Hopefully, we're hopefully going to have drop grants that help out with that. But that's another big need in our community.
It absolutely is. And you mentioned funding for this. Do you pass that expense on to the individual consumer who's ordered service? Because if you start looking at distances, a lot of times your cumulative drop length across a community is just as long as your infrastructure in the right of way. The distance is the same. Now, the cost for the fiber sizing and things like that may be a little less, but it's still a lot of asset that needs to be addressed.
Sure. You're still running a trench or conduit all the way up the driveway in and then pulling fiber through it. I mean, it's a lot of work to get into these houses.
Sure.
All right. So let's take a break, and when we come back, I'd like to talk about St. Tammany Parish and how we may relate to other municipalities that you guys have done some work with.
The FCC has a new map showing where internet service is and is not available across the country. You can now check to see whether broadband internet service is available at your home or business and dispute the data if the map is inaccurate. Go to broadbandmap.fcc.gov, type in your address, and select the best match from the list of addresses that displays. The address or location you selected will then appear as a point on the map. To the right side of the map, you'll see information about internet services available at the location. Red locations on the map indicate that no internet services are reported for that location. If you think that any information about the location itself on the map is incorrect, like the address or a misidentification of which building on a property is the home, select the Location Challenge link with the location information to the right of the map. Enter the required information. Check the certification box at the bottom of the form and select Submit. If the location you're looking for is missing from the map, zoom to the general area and select a point on the map where your home or business is located. Then select Location Challenge and complete the form. Looking at the list of internet services, if one of the services listed is not actually offered to the selected location, you can select the Availability Challenge link. This will open a form where you can first select the provider to challenge. Scroll down and complete the form, selecting the reason for your challenge from the drop-down list. Options include the reported service is not available, or the provider is requesting more than a standard installation fee to get you connected. You can upload files like emails or screenshots to support your challenge, or you can write a description of your experience in the form. Check the certification box at the bottom of the form and select Submit to submit your challenge. With your help, the map will be more accurate, and an accurate map is an important tool for expanding internet services to all Americans. broadbandmap.fcc.gov.
Lee, welcome back. We'd like to talk a little bit about St. Tammany Parish and what we're doing here.
Excellent.
All right, so you've been looking at the needs, you've pulled in some data. So what do you see in St. Tammany Parish so far?
So right now we see that a lot of the community does have that limitation on service. A lot of areas are served. There are some unserved areas. But again, this isn't completely about just internet connectivity. This is thinking about the future. And if we're going to go in and build broadband connectivity, how else might that be applied? So we're looking at some of the more rural areas on the north or maybe on the eastern boundaries of St. Tammany. Where this connectivity, where is it lacking from an infrastructure and a services perspective? So some of our focus is on that. Something else that we've been working through this process as part of our program, broadband master planning, is who's providing service there now? What kind of infrastructure do they have in place? And so that's starting to open a lot of doors, gain a lot of interest for folks that are saying, hey, I'm already doing work in your community. How can we work together? And that's really what we're looking for, is that partnership to really push this forward.
Yeah, because I think from a parish perspective, we don't want to be an ISP. We really want to just make sure citizens get internet. I mean, that's really our focus. So if you look at other projects you've done, can you say somewhere else that maybe can relate to us, or lessons that you've learned that could, apply here?
Sure. Well, for starters, every community is different. So understanding what that community's needs are specific and key. One good reference was Huntsville Utilities. And this is up in Huntsville, Alabama, North Alabama. So Huntsville Utilities is a city-owned power, water, gas, and now fiber utility. And in this case, they own the physical cable, the physical fiber network, but they are not a service provider. Google Fiber has come in and partnered with the city of Huntsville. Huntsville owns the network. They lease access to that physical fiber network to Google Fiber. And then Google Fiber deals with and markets to consumers. That's where the billing comes into play. And Google Fiber is the ISP, internet service provider, to those consumers. Now, one big distinction we learned in this, and it was a great plan, and it's been a huge success. And if you look at the growth in Huntsville, it's a tremendous part of why that's happening. In that market, Huntsville owns the cabling in the right-of-way and on the poles or in the ground, but they don't own the drops. And that's from that right-of-way to the house that we talked about earlier.
Sure.
That's a key significant factor. When you separate the network like that, you really give ownership of that network or control of that network to the final piece of that network. So in this marketplace, unless somebody comes out and places another drop from the right-of-way to the house and leases another fiber from Huntsville, Google actually controls that consumer's connectivity program. So that's really interesting. And so it would be my recommendation that whoever owns that network owns the cabling in the right of way or on the poles or in the ground, but also that last part, we talked about middle mile and last mile. It's kind of like the last yard or the last foot. They need to own that as well. So that's one good takeaway, but still a very successful market has had great boom for the community there.
So if you look at, you're saying from the drops, Google owns that. So who owns the back end network and that infrastructure and everything behind that?
So all of that's owned by Huntsville Utilities.
Okay.
And in that case, that's a dark port or a dark fiber lease. They don't own any of the active electronics that make that network work. They own just the infrastructure. You can even think of that like a toll road. In that case, Google Fiber has all their own active electronics. They connect on the A end at the head end, and then they connect through Huntsville's network to the consumer on the Z end.
Okay. So you talked about the kind of that. I guess that's a partnership where they own it. Have you done anything different than that, or is that kind of your base model?
So it's a great model, but there are others. Another one I think is of significant mention is Breckenridge, Colorado. So in this case, we were asked to come in. Breckenridge was losing revenue off of sales because those credit card purchases were not going through because they had poor connectivity. So they came to us. We designed a network for them. They funded the build. And in this case, the city of Breckenridge is the network owner, and they own all of the network. But the city does not want to be a service provider. They don't want to be in that competitive space. So they've partnered with a company called Allo Communications, and Allo is the ISP. And Allo was able to come in. They set up their head end. They work with the city. They had a partnership in this case, and they also deal with that consumer. So this is another great example of a partnership where you've got a city or a community who already understands infrastructure deployment management very well. You do other things like water or streets or whatever the case may be, but they don't need to be in that services provision side of things. So they find a good partner to work with. It's been a really great access for that community as well.
So a lot of public-private partnerships. That's kind of where you see these things headed.
Absolutely, I think it's essential. I've always kind of waved the flag that telcos may not be providing the service that we want everywhere, but they're not the bad guy.
Sure.
These guys are running a business and they need to be profitable. And as we talked about earlier, the rural markets, it's hard to create a profitability out of that. But we can come in and provide funding. Well, this creates a way for that business model to work. And one of the great things that those private telephone companies do, they've got decades and in some cases over a century of experience providing service. So they're really suitable and stabilized in that space. So it opens up for a really good partnership where you still have some level of competition with services. It's going to push quality. It's going to push innovation. It's also going to manage what pricing is going to look like. So it really creates a good scenario.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's kind of where you have to go because, from internet perspective, really just use the federal funds for an assist.
Absolutely. And I think that's the intention behind all of this. When it began through NTIA and as it's being filtered down to each individual state where there's a broadband deployment office in each state, there's one as well there in Louisiana. They really are encouraging those private telcos who will need to be a part of this to get access to that funding. They really want them to work with those communities. When you consider this is, tax dollars funding this, these are grants and funds that are coming from a tax base. If it's of the people, it should be by the people and for the people. And I think this is a great example of that.
That's fantastic. I like that. So how long do you think this will take to run fiber through the parish and get rural citizens access?
So as we start looking at kind of forecasting the timelines, we know what NTIA is put in place. Each state has kind of come up with a 5-year action plan by June of this year. Submissions need to be going into that throughout the end of this year. And then once those applications have been reviewed and approved by the states and by the Fed, then we start to see funding really roll out in 2025. So that's really seems like a long way away. That's going to come really fast. And there's a lot of really good planning that needs to happen before that. Now, once that begins, we're going to see a few more years of all this being rolled out. So I think it's reasonable to say that you'll start to see significant impact to broadband connectivity within the next, 4 to 6, 7 years. But as that rolls out, understand that this is really the first splash in this space. I think this is going to be a really good stepping stone to even bigger projects. We're laying that foundation now, and if we do this properly, it's going to open doors up for even further expansion and greater services in the future.
Okay. Well, Lee, I look forward to seeing your recommendations in the future, and I appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. We're looking forward to it as well.
Thanks for watching Tammany Tech. We'll see you next time.